Um, if we can look first of all at the Sunday Times story about the way this £800,000 loan guarantee was arranged, apparently through an introduction from the man who then went on to be chairman of the BBC. What do you make of this?
Well, I think it's a complicated story, but it raises a lot of concerns, and there are still, to my mind, quite a lot of unanswered questions. I mean, if we look at the timetable, Richard Sharp applied for the role of chair of the BBC in October. In November, he seems to have got involved in a conversation with Sam Blythe, the person who ultimately guaranteed the 800,000, and then went on his behalf to go and see the cabinet secretary Simon Case, and none of this was made known, as far as we can tell, to the independent recruitment panel. That is a big concern for me, particularly given the importance of the chair of the BBC. It's an independent role, and the recruitment must be absolutely be above reproach, really. And this feels to have been a quite important departure from what should really happen.
And both Boris Johnson and the Richard Sharp have both said that there was no conflict of interest. Do you accept that?
No, I'm afraid I don't. Richard Sharp clearly made the introduction, if you like, to Sam Blythe, to the cabinet secretary. Quite why he did it rather than the prime minister, who obviously was meeting the cabinet secretary regularly, almost daily, I suspect, is not absolutely clear. And it was very, very clear and well known that the decision on the chairman of the BBC would lie with the prime minister as a recommendation to the then Queen. Absolutely, he was in the midst of a recruitment process to an important job, and at the same time, at the very least, he was doing a favour to the Prime Minister by facilitating the conversations about the loan, which happened before the formal appointment was made. It raises quite a few questions, I'm afraid,
And
about that. And it is a conflict, no question in my mind.
This wasn't just a formal email introduction. We now learn in the Sunday Times that Boris Johnson, Richard Sharp, and the person ultimately responsible for the loan, Mr. Blythe, all had a cosy dinner together at Chequers to arrange all of this. Does this sort of thing matter? Does this once again raise those questions over a potential, at least, conflict of interest?
Yes, it does. Now, they all deny that they talked about the issue of the loan, but almost beggars belief, really, that they could have done that, quite honestly, to have had said nothing, despite the fact that they were all actively involved in the process of the loan. It was only really until the end of December, and I think after the Prime Minister had effectively made his decision, that the ethics team in the Cabinet Office said, basically, Richard Sharp, you shouldn't have any more involvement in this loan. But frankly, the point had been passed, really, where he'd already had an involvement. So that, I think, doesn't quite deal with the issue.
Does it seem
I
at all
think
strange to you that Simon Case, the cabinet secretary, was apparently aware of all this, and clearly did nothing to stop it? Apparently, gave it the go-ahead, and yet we've only just learnt about it.
I think it is, to my mind, surprising that Simon Case went ahead with the meeting with Richard Sharp in early December. We clearly don't have all the facts, so I'm being careful here in terms of what I say because I don't know the full detail here. But it is, to my mind, a question as to why he would have gone ahead with that meeting, potentially knowing the position that Richard Sharp was a strong contender to the chairman of the BBC role. I think there's also a question as to why the appointments panel, the independent appointments panel, doesn't seem to have been aware of the fact that this was going on. So there are some questions here to answer, really, for almost everybody involved, including the cabinet secretary, I'm afraid.
So we've got this request from Labour for the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner to investigate. I mean, should they investigate the role of the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, who's still there in number 10 today, as well as the way that Sharp was appointed to that top role at the BBC, and whether the arrangement was a suitable one for someone who was Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson?
I think the Standards Commissioner will really only be in a position to look at the behaviour of Boris Johnson. I don't think they have a remit in relation to the Cabinet Secretary, but there are others who might do. A number of the select committees, such as the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, might look further at this. So I think the whole thing needs to be explored, not simply the role of the former Prime Minister.
What about Nadim Zahawi? Boris Johnson is now clearly a backbencher. Nadim Zahawi is the chair of the Conservative Party. He's got a cabinet role. He says that HMRC are satisfied that the error he made in his tax arrangements was a mistake, and that it was not deliberate. It was careless but not deliberate. Is that good enough?
Just before I come on to that, I think it's worth saying that Boris Johnson is a backbencher, but he appears to be still very interested in returning as Prime Minister. So the issues here are relevant in that respect alone. But moving on to Nadim Zahawi, I think the question here is that when the arrangements were set up, where his shares effectively were given to his father, and then located in an offshore arrangement through Balshore Investments, why that, in a sense, when it was challenged by HMRC, went on for so long. And it appears, and I say appears, to have only really been addressed at the point he became the Chancellor of the Exchequer. If he was, in a sense, innocent here, it was an unintended error. I do ask the question why it took so long to get the issue resolved, really.
So you've got the man who was at that stage Chancellor overall in
Mm.
charge of HMRC coming to an arrangement with HMRC to pay what was described as a penalty, a multi-million pounds in total, on his tax bill.
It's not comfortable. It's not a good look, as they say. And even more of an issue is the fact that it wasn't resolved well before that happened. Why did it drag on? It appears to be a number of years in discussion with HMRC. And I think also a question as to why the then Chancellor was so robust in his denial, really, of an issue when there clearly was an issue. So there are some quite big questions to be answered here. I don't say that with any enthusiasm because we've had so many of these stories recently, and I think they do nothing but damage the respect of the public for the institutions in this country. But I think we have to get further into this one and get to the bottom of what really has gone on.
And Rishi Sunak, when he became Prime Minister after those turbulent few months, said that he was determined to lead a government of integrity and professionalism. What do you think he should do about all of this?
You're right, he did. I think all of us hoped that he was going to be able to follow through on that, but he still seems to be dogged by problems in this respect. And there is even, I think, some suggestion that he had some role in relation to the two stories that we are currently talking about. I think his only recourse here is to be very, very transparent, absolutely get everything out on the table, even if some of it's inconvenient, even if it ultimately means he has to make some more difficult decisions about roles such as that of Nadim's. And I think he's also got to rigorously use his new advisor on ethics that he's recently appointed, and make sure that that person is being given full responsibility for investigating these issues. He has to be unambiguously on the side of complete transparency and complete integrity. I think if he doesn't do that, people will start to say, well, what's the difference, really? Maybe this is just another form of what we saw with Boris Johnson. And that would be, I think, damaging to the institutions and damaging to him as well.
So does that mean sacking Nadim Zahawi, at least until these questions have all been settled?
Well, I think he needs to himself be absolutely fully briefed on what happened and why it happened. If he's not satisfied that he's got the full answers, then I think at least a suspension whilst he investigates it will be appropriate. And it may be that if he is deeply concerned about how things went, this might lead to a sacking. But I think he cannot let the issue drift on without being definitively clear that he knows all the facts, he knows what happened and why, and that he either concludes that it is above board, genuinely above board, and things carry on, or else he says, "No, we've got an issue here, and I need to act really." And he can't allow this to drift. It will do him a lot of damage.